Good evening. In this video, I'm going to be discussing one of my favorite topics. It's a topic that's fascinated many people for a long time, and that is Atlantis. So, I am a huge lover of history, especially ancient history, and I am excited to talk about Atlantis. Now, there are so many videos out there about Atlantis. Obviously, you have everything from Disney's wild, fanciful imagination of Atlantis to all kinds of stuff out there. Every YouTuber's got their Atlantis theory and all that. So I understand it's sort of a sticky subject. However, um, after many hours of research and reading, of watching videos, of reading articles, um, I feel pretty confident about the Atlantis story, what's true about it, and I'll just go ahead and be a spoiler right at the beginning, and that is to say that I think Plato was right. I think that Atlantis is on the southwest coast of Spain, just past the Gates of Heracles. So, in other words, through the Straits of Gibraltar, right on the Atlantic coast. So, there's been a lot of more recent scholarship that's pointed to that location. National Geographic has a great video on finding Atlantis, and they end up there, which I was very pleased. I thought they did a great job looking at some of the other possible locations for Atlantis. I know there's been places in the Aegean Sea and all through the Mediterranean where they're like, this could be Atlantis and that could be Atlantis. And people have suggested Cuba could be Atlantis or North Africa could be Atlantis. There's so many like Atlantis possibilities. But Plato wrote about the destruction of Atlantis, and he told us where it was. And he said it was right past the Straits of Gibraltar on the Atlantic coast. And the evidence seems to be pointing there stronger than ever. So that is where I think Atlantis is. I think that is the best place for it. Now, obviously, just saying this is the location of Atlantis is just sort of the beginning of the narrative, right? I mean, there's so much more to the story. But what we know is that the Atlanteans were a seafaring people. They had a coastal civilization. Uh, I'm a Christian and I believe the biblical narrative, and I know that can scare some people away right away when you're talking about ancient civilization because of how much the Bible tends to be discounted by modern scholarship. And then also on the flip side, all the anti-intellectualism and fundamentalism of the last 100 years or so, and is sort of a overreaction to critical scholarship. And so, I love history and I love scripture, and for the last 200 years, that's been a real interesting division, if you will. But I do believe the Bible offers a plausible narrative that aligns with the evidence that we see around the world. Everything from megalithic structures to Atlantis to whatever else you might find. I do think the Bible offers a plausible narrative for the true history of the world. And obviously, the Bible doesn't speak about Atlantis, and the Bible's not a science textbook or anything like that. But it does offer a plausible meta-narrative for the history of the world. People do different things with that, I understand, but as a committed Christian, I tend to listen to the Bible with more authoritatively than modern scholarship would. But that being said, I do believe that Noah and his family were a real family, that Noah's flood happened. I don't think Noah's flood is the destruction of Atlantis. I believe Atlantis happened after Noah's flood. So, based on my reading and research, and again, I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time in this video talking about all of my sources and different things that I've studied, but I've studied a lot. I love it. But I just say this, right? Atlantis is a post-flood civilization, which means it was people, descendants of Noah, who were the Atlanteans. And there's been a lot of scholarship on the 16 grandsons of Noah and their descendants. And so we know that the descendants of Japheth moved up into Europe for the most part, that Shem was Semitic and Asian, and that the descendants of Ham were more in the African uh, lineages. And so that's a little bit of generalizations, clearly, right? There was intermarriages between some of those bloodlines and different things, and we're all from Noah. But at the same time, the ancient Hebrews understood different peoples based on their ancestral lines. So Javan was the Greeks, the Ionian Greeks, right? He was a descendant of Noah, a descendant of Japheth. People knew he's Javan, right? Tiras was another son of Japheth. Um, you had Ham, obviously, and Canaan and Cush, and the Cushites who were down in Ethiopia. So we know even today there are cities that are connected to some of these 16 grandsons of Noah. So the ancient world, there was still a sense of people knew where they came from. They knew which son of Noah they were from, just like the Israelites descended from Shem. And the Atlanteans are descendants of Sidon, one of the descendants of Ham. And the Sidonians were where we get the Phoenicians and the Philistines and other Palestinians and the coastal cities, the Minoans. But they're known as seafaring people, which is what we see the Atlanteans are. So the Atlanteans are seafaring people. They are coastal people. When the Israelites come into the land of Canaan, right? Canaan was a son of Ham, one of the 16 grandsons of Noah. When they come into the land of Canaan, right, they're dealing with the descendants of Sidon. There's a city, the city of Sidon, and the Philistines were there. But where are they dwelling, right? Their cities are the coastal cities. They have the god Dagon, who's half fish, half man. So they were definitely a coastal people, a seafaring people, and that is corroborated by the Bible, that's corroborated by history. We know that, right? These people who lived along the coast, Tyre and Sidon, they were seafaring people. So I believe that the Minoan culture, the Atlantean culture, Carthaginian culture, Sidonian culture, they're all coming from a common father, and that is Sidon, which fascinatingly enough, right, the name Poseidon means father Sidon. So the god of the sea, according to ancient Greek mythology, is Sidon, right? That father of this line of people. So the Atlanteans being Sidonians, right, from the line of Sidon through Canaan and Ham back to Noah, they were a seafaring people who, according to the ancient Greeks, knew their way around the ocean. So it totally makes sense, right? They're starting, the ark lands in eastern Turkey. People are spreading out. We know that the descendants of Ham are moving south and towards the coast, and some are moving down into Africa. But it just makes sense. As people are fruitful and multiply, that's how God made us and designed us, they would spread. And so these seafaring people naturally are moving across the Mediterranean, right? The island of Crete, the Minoans, it's right there. You keep going, right, all the way to the edge, all the way to the Straits of Gibraltar or the Gates of Heracles or Hercules. And it would totally make sense that people would build a capital city, a prominent city right there at the gates between the Mediterranean world and the Atlantic Ocean, right? There's a significant difference between Mediterranean and Atlantic, but they're right there in that space. And Plato says that's where the city was. And thankfully, scholarship today is beginning to see that actually is very plausible and makes a whole lot of sense. Now, I think part of the reason why people come up with different theories about other places, and some of them seem quite plausible across the Mediterranean and even in some of North Africa, my understanding of that is because Atlantis, well, it was a city, and it was in southwestern Spain, and just where Plato said it was. It also is part of a seafaring civilization, a coastal city civilization, stretching from Sidon to Carthage, right, Crete, all the way to Spain, and beyond, right? The Canary Islands, North Africa. So you have this coastal people. They're interconnected across the water. They're people of the sea. Boats are in their DNA, so to speak. Well, it just makes sense then that if the sea is going to rise up and destroy the capital, that if it was indeed rising sea levels, a rapid rise in sea level, it would make sense that their entire civilization built around the coastlines would be severely disrupted by that cataclysm. So my understanding of that event is that it was sometime after the flood, however many hundreds of years after the flood. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the flood geology in this video or what happened during the flood, but what we do know is that there's a lot of volcanic activity. So my understanding of the post-flood world is that there's an extreme amount of volcanism, lots of volcanoes, massive volcanoes that are hard to understand, help create an ice age. And we know about the cooling effects of volcanoes, right? Back in the year 1815, April of 1815, there was a massive volcano in Indonesia that erupted, and it actually caused climate change. For the whole year of 1816, we had winter, right? It was the year with no summer. So it snowed all through July in the United States. We didn't have summer. It was cool. It was cold. It was the coldest year on record between like 1700s and the year 2000. We have this modern scientific data that says when a massive volcano erupts in Indonesia, it affects the climate for the whole world for this extended period of time. But we know from the geological evidence there were massive volcanoes in the past, bigger than that, that erupted. So if you can imagine these humongous volcanoes going off sort of concurrently, that's completely plausible that it would lead to an ice age, right? It's significant cooling of the earth, which is what we have evidence, right? We have evidence of ice age and glaciers in this post-flood world. But if a lot of that seawater is in glaciers and that water's trapped and not in the ocean, then we'll see lower ocean levels, right? Today, glaciers are melting, which is not the cataclysm that the liberals want you to think it is. It is significant, right? No doubt it is significant. And it is affecting climate change. Like, that's observable. And it's affecting climate change in a way that could impact human populations in ways that are problematic. So there's definitely reason to consider the possibility of desertification and people being experiencing famine or starvation as a result of climate change due to global warming. I hate that term because I think it's an alarmist term, and I think it's completely been blown out of proportion for years and years and years. So I'm not talking about the alarmist narrative of the left, but obviously glaciers are melting, the temperature of the earth might be going up a little bit, and that could cause disruptions for human populations in some parts of the world. And if there is hunger or famine or desertification, that's something that should grieve us, especially as Christians, to want to love our neighbors well and do something about that. So I'm not just want to throw that in there, because when we talk about all this stuff, a lot of times people just immediately assume that Christians have some kind of fundamentalist, right-wing, ultra-conservative agenda, and that's not at all the case. And so what I do want to say that the melting glaciers are not highly problematic in the way that the alarmist narrative wants you to believe, right? They're just melting. That's what they're bound to do. That's what they've been doing for years. It could be accelerating a bit now, but it's not alarming because the glaciers formed after the flood in response to the volcanism. And so all that to say, right, Atlantis was a post-flood rapid climate change cataclysm. That's my understanding of what happened. That, some people point back to the Younger Dryas comet as causing a cataclysm connected to an ice age, and then some people are saying, well, it's really Noah's flood. And I don't want to get into all that, and obviously there's a lot of timeline that has to be worked through. I don't pretend to have all that figured out, but what we do know is that there's plenty of evidence of volcanoes and comets and plenty of disruptive events in the past. And some of that could have easily led to that sudden rise in sea level, right? I mean, we get concerned about a few inches, but this was like 100 feet of sea level rise. And we see the evidence for this all over the world. Cities submerged in like 100 feet of water, especially around the Mediterranean. So if you can imagine this Atlantean civilization that's building along this, it's right after the flood. Sea levels are down because of glaciation, because of that ice age. And then suddenly there's an event that causes a lot of melt. The sea levels rise rapidly. And this coastal civilization then is disrupted and destroyed. And it's fascinating too that Plato does attribute the destruction of Atlantis to the judgment of Zeus, I believe it is. In other words, divine judgment, right? A god is angry with the Atlanteans and destroys them with a flood, essentially, right? So this idea of flooding and destruction being divine judgment on people is deep in our psyche. But totally makes sense because all of us are the descendants of Noah and his family who survived that cataclysm, right? The world that then was destroyed by water. And that judgment motif connected to water is deep in our psyche. And so it makes a lot of sense that people like Plato would be interpreting these events as, oh, this must be divine judgment. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, right? That's not my argument in this video. Obviously, we know from scripture that the great flood was divine judgment on the world that then was. But we also have God's promise after the flood that he was going to preserve the earth. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be famines here or a localized flood here or rising sea levels or disruptions to human civilizations in a more localized setting. Clearly, there are those things, but he has promised that until the end of the age, there will be seed time and harvest, winter and spring. And God has promised not to flood the world again destroy it with a flood. And he's put his rainbow in the clouds as a covenant sign and seal of that. And so we have confidence that God is going to preserve our world until the end of this age, which of course is the second coming of Jesus Christ. So we don't have to be alarmist about post-flood climate change and disruptions, right? They've happened off and on throughout human history. Atlantis was one example of that. Obviously, it's devastating and it's problematic, but it isn't a universal cataclysm, and it's not alarmist. So again, why does Plato attribute the destruction of Atlantis to divine judgment? I believe it's because that's deeply embedded in the human psyche, and it's like, hey, flood hit the coastal cities of the Atlanteans, must be divine judgment. Now, so you have this coastal civilization destroyed by water. The main seaport, of course, being on the southwest coast of Spain, now 100 feet under the ocean. That's going to be extremely traumatic for the people, right? But obviously some people survive. Now, who are the survivors? Where did the Atlanteans go? Some people would suggest that the sea peoples who invaded Egypt, there's narrative about that. I haven't studied that particular trajectory as much, so I don't have as confident of a belief around were Atlanteans who suddenly were without home and kind of moving inland. Were they moving into Egypt and attacking the Egyptians there, the sons of Mizraim? Perhaps. I think that's very plausible. I think that the sea peoples talked about in Egypt could very well be Atlanteans. I know that timeline stuff would have to be resolved and all of that, but I just think here's the story. It makes a lot of sense. Another fascinating, it's one of the most fascinating pieces for me, is the case of the Basque people. They live in northern Spain, southern France. So there's French Basque and Spanish Basque, but they're not European, right? They have an extremely unique bloodline. They're not European. It's been a really interesting thing to kind of delve into. Obviously, they've been studied tremendously in recent days by a lot of different people. But one of the most fascinating things for me about the Basque people is that they have oral traditions that say they are Atlanteans, that they left their city of Atlantis at the time of the destruction and fled by boats. Well, if you agree that Atlantis is on the southwest corner of Spain, where Plato says it was, it's just up around the Iberian Peninsula. Like, it's totally plausible that people fleeing that destruction on boats, survivors of this cataclysm, would sail around the Iberian Peninsula and end up in Basque country. Like, there's nothing implausible about that. And they're like, hey, and the sea and the identity is deeply embedded in their psyche. So Basque is not related linguistically to the European languages. They're not sons of Japheth, essentially, is what that means. Right? But if you believe they're Atlanteans, and that Atlanteans are Sidonians, and that they're actually Hamites, they're coming from the line of Ham, makes total sense. Another fascinating thing about the Basque also, many of you probably have heard about running with the bulls in Pamplona. Well, the bull is a sacred animal to the Canaanites. We go all the way back to the biblical narrative. Baal worship, the golden calf, the calves, the sin of Jeroboam set up the golden calves, right? Canaanite worship often had bulls. If you believe that the Minoans were part of this Atlantean, Phoenician, Sidonian lineage, bloodline civilization, right? The Minotaur. Well, Minotaur is, tar is bull, right? Taurus, toro in Spanish. Bull. Minos bull. So the Minotaur is this mythic creature, right? Body of a man, head of a bull, the labyrinth and all that, right? There's whatever. The bottom line is we also have images in Minoan culture of people jumping over bulls as part of their rituals, their worship, their sacred liturgy, if you will. So what we see is that peoples from Canaan, Sidonians, the Minoans, they have this bull worship. They have Minos bull, and in the Minoans, they have people jumping over bulls. And what do you see today in Basque Country? People running with bulls, leaping over bulls. What is that? So to me, it's one of the clearest connection points to say running with the bulls in northern Spain probably goes all the way back to Crete, the Minotaur, the bull leaping that we see in those paintings, and then all the way back to the land of Canaan, connected even to Baal worship and the golden calf and all of that. So again, people probably think I'm crazy, but I see perfect evidence here, right? These sons of Sidon are seafaring people. He's the god of the sea. They end up in this port city that's connected in the Atlantic Ocean with the Mediterranean. Sea levels rise rapidly. People flee. They flee into Egypt and cause disruption there. The sea peoples invade. They go around to the north side of Iberia and they settle there. And the Basque people literally say that we are people of the sea. We left Atlantis, right? That's their own oral tradition. And they're not European. And their language isn't European. And their blood isn't European. But they live in Europe. Well, European just means son of Japheth, right? Europeans are the descendants of Japheth. So, totally lines up. It's very fascinating and it makes sense. So these people say, we're Atlanteans. The sea is part of their culture and their psyche. They have the bull as a prominent animal in their festivals. It all makes sense, right? Where do you see seafaring people who make a big deal out of bovine animals, right? You see that from Canaan to Crete to the Basque Country. So you see this amazing connection point there. Um, so yeah, Atlantis is super fascinating. There's so much more that can be said. Like I said, if you just want a fascinating kind of archaeological video, National Geographic video on Atlantis is really, really well done. I think they do a good job kind of ending up there. A lot of people are going to be all over the place with this, but at the end of the day, it's a real story about a real place, time in our history. People just like us, descendants of Noah and his family, were living along the coast of the Mediterranean. There was a cataclysmic event, rapidly rising sea levels. Their whole civilization was disrupted by this event. I mean, it's not that hard to imagine, right? I mean, we just had a hurricane go through Florida recently. It devastated Fort Myers. My parents have a condo down there, right? Sanibel Island's destroyed. Fort Myers Beach is destroyed. We have all of this destruction we see from, one storm coming through. You can imagine, people have these map projections of like, Florida's going to go blue eventually when, the sea levels rise. Well, it's if that happened tomorrow rapidly and Miami was underwater, right? That would be insanely destructive and disruptive and cataclysmic, and we would talk about it, and that story would be a part of us, and we would tell it. So it makes total sense that Plato would have this story and say, this happened, right? These people lived here and this crazy destructive event took place, and their civilization was totally disrupted, and their capital city was swallowed up by the sea in divine judgment, right? And their people were dispersed all over the earth. Well, you know, Middle Earth, right? Mediterranean. That was kind of his whole context for the world. But you see that, everything from the Basque to North Africa to the Canary Islands to Carthage to the Minoans to the Sidonians, it's all interconnected. We're all descendants of Noah, and that's Atlantis, right? It didn't sink into the ocean, and there's not some underwater civilization that's super advanced and still like existing that could be found by an explorer. If you've ever watched the Disney version of Atlantis, right? It's super far-fetched, and you have other people who bring in stuff like alien portals and so many weird, crazy spin-offs of Atlantis. But I think the real history of Atlantis is what I've just described. Obviously, I haven't given a lot of sources, and I haven't tried to be overly heavy with, here's this primary source document and all that. Bottom line is, based on my understanding of history and what I believe happened in the ancient past, I think it makes total sense that these people, Noah's great-great-grandchildren, etc., settled along the Mediterranean. Their civilization, their family line, they spread. This is what they passed on from generation to generation. Hey, we know the sea. We build boats. We know the stars. We know how to navigate. We build these cities with these concentric circle ports that allows us have safe harbor. We're masters of the sea. Our civilization is built around the sea. We have gods that are half fish and half man, but we also have gods that are bulls. And we have a minotaur, and we jump over bulls, and we run with the bulls, but our heart's in the sea, and our identity comes from the sea. And when the sea swallowed up most of our civilization in a cataclysmic event, it disrupted our whole civilization. So we invaded Egypt, and we settled in Basque Country. And that's Atlantis. So I think, honestly, excavating southwestern Spain more intentionally would be amazing. I would love to see them really go after that part of the world, really explore and get after that, and give us some more scientific consensus on that. Obviously, people want Atlantis to be mysterious, and people don't really want Atlantis to be understood the way I've just articulated because it takes all the fun out of it. But it would be so cool if they actually like were able to really excavate Atlantis. Now, obviously, being underwater is a problem, but they found some evidences of Atlantis in sort of some marshy lands there along the southwestern coast of Spain. So I think there's still a lot of work that could be done along the southwestern coast of Spain that would be fascinating to see. And I think another thing that would be so cool is to see the connection with the Basque people to Atlantis and take that seriously. Um, that's who they say they are. So why not believe them and figure that out and explore it? It really bugs me when people just dismiss that because like, oh, that can't be Atlantis. It's like, no, they literally are like, we're people of the sea. We're from Atlantis. Our city was destroyed and we escaped on boats. And that's how we got here. And you're like, nah, that can't be right. It's like, no, like my ancestors migrated from Europe to the United States about 100 to 200 years ago. I don't know those stories super well, but like I know that's true. Like I had like Germans and English and Danish and stuff, right? People came from Europe and they settled in America. And like I know some of that history. Like I can tell you, like my ancestors are from Europe. So when the Basque people say we're Atlanteans, it's like why not just believe them? That would be such a cool thing to explore. So Atlantis, well, I think we know for sure today where it's located, and we basically have a good idea of what happened. And essentially, we're just like, yeah, Plato was right. He had no reason to lie. He didn't lie. But there's so many other pieces to be explored. The connection of the Basque people to Atlantis would be so fascinating for me. And like I said, just digging it up. Like, let's see what's really there. And don't be offended. Like, if you thought Atlantis was in the Canary Islands, like, you're not wrong, right? If you thought Atlantis was somewhere like else in the Mediterranean, there's a sense in which you're not wrong because it was a whole civilization. They settled along the coast. It wasn't. They were in the Canary Islands. They were in the mountains of North Africa. That's true, right? It's not like you're just so concentrated in one spot that Atlantis is just this place. But the main city, that city that was destroyed, is just past the gates of Heracles, right where Plato said. Obviously, then we also have to work out a lot of the timeline issues between biblical narrative and secular timelines and stuff like that. But so many people have been doing that with Egyptian history, and working some of that out. So it's totally doable. Anyway, I'm going to sign off, but that is Atlantis. So hopefully that was super informative for you. Thanks.